The cart hit a deep rut in the road and lurched sideways, and King Darius Ashvale grabbed the wooden sideboard with both hands to steady himself. His knuckles whitened in the cold. His hood was pulled low over his forehead, and his face was turned slightly downward, giving him the unassuming look of a man tired from travel, which was not entirely a performance. He had been in motion since before dawn. Beside him, a farmhand named Owen guided an old brown horse through the mud, with quiet, patient clicks of his tongue, completely unaware that the man sitting 3 inches to his left could sign a single document and redraw the borders of this entire kingdom, if he chose to. Darius said nothing. He kept his eyes forward and let the road come to him. He had been on this cart for 2 hours, 2 hours of uneven road and cold wind, and the particular silence of open country in early spring, when the trees were not yet full, and the fields were turned but not yet green. Owen had offered the seat because Darius had appeared at the edge of the village of Crestwall at the right time, and with a small amount of coin, and the easy look of a man who traveled for work. Owen was a cheerful person, who found most situations acceptable. He had whistled the same 3 notes of an unfinished tune for most of the ride, and seemed satisfied with this, as a way of filling time. Darius had made this decision, against the advice of every person whose counsel he trusted. His general and closest advisor, Fletcher Vane, had expressed himself with the particular controlled despair he reserved for ideas he found unworkable, and could not actually prevent. He had stood in the strategy room with his hands clasped behind his back, and watched Darius pack a canvas bag with servant's clothing, and had said, with the measured delivery of a man making his final attempt at reason, that this was perhaps the most unusual thing a sitting king had ever done in the documented history of the Ironmore Kingdom. That may well be true, Darius had said, pressing a rough wool cloak into the bag. You will be recognized, Fletcher had said. You have a bearing. There is something about the way you stand and move and hold a room that is difficult to mistake. A cloak does not change that. I was a soldier before I was a king, Darius had said. I know how to disappear into a context. That was 18 years ago. Then I will be somewhat rusty, Darius had said, and I will manage. Fletcher had been silent for a long moment, looking at the bag and the man packing it. What is it you are hoping to find? He had said at last, in a different tone, a quieter one. Something true, Darius had said, about who she actually is. Fletcher had understood that. He was a man who understood most things about Darius, including the things Darius did not say aloud. He had pressed his lips together and given a single slow nod of the kind that means, I disagree with the method and the timing, and the decision has already been made, and both of those things are simultaneously true. The reason for the plan was this. 4 months earlier, the Royal Council had placed a folder on the strategy table, with quiet satisfaction, and presented the king with what they described as the most politically sensible marital alliance currently available. Lady Seraphina Calwell, of the Southern Calwell estate. Her family's finances were declining, but their standing remained intact. The southern province had been unsettled since the drought 2 seasons back. The match would bring stability where the province needed it, and lift the Calwell family from their financial difficulty. Everyone would gain something. It was efficient and sensible, and the council had been visibly pleased with themselves for working it out. Darius had read the reports. He had read them with the same deliberate attention he applied to everything, understanding that a decision built on incomplete information was not a real decision, but a risk dressed up as one. The reports were thorough in some directions. They covered age, health, education, the condition of the estate, the nature of Lord Edmund Calwell's specific debts, and a general assessment of the household's reputation in the province. On the matter of Lady Seraphina herself, the most consistent description offered was the word pleasant, which appeared 3 times in 4 pages. Agreeable appeared twice. There was a single line about her posture, and a note that she was well read for a woman of her position. There was nothing about what she thought or what she wanted. Nothing about her specific qualities of mind. Nothing about how she behaved when no one of consequence was watching her, or whether the report's authors had found it relevant to look. He had closed the folder. He had told the council he would consider the matter carefully. 4 months later, he was on a farm cart in borrowed clothes, approaching a property he had never visited, to find the things the reports had missed. It was not, in the strictest sense, a dignified plan. He did not particularly care about that. Owen was talkative in the uncomplicated way of a man who had reached a general peace with most situations. He had, early in the ride, Offered that he knew the Calwell estate well, because he delivered grain there twice a year. Good people overall, he had said, though Lord Edmund was the kind of man who had decided what he thought about most things and did not appear interested in new information. But the young lady, Lady Seraphina, she was something else entirely. Last spring she had stood in a tenant farmer's yard in the rain, in her good dress, and argued her father down from seizing the man's horses over an unpaid debt. The whole village had seen it. Darius had filed this information in the organized part of his mind, where he kept things that were actually useful and let the rest go. The road curved between two low hills, and through the bare early spring trees ahead, he got his first partial view of the Calwell estate. A cluster of stone buildings, anchored by a main house that had once been genuinely fine. He could see that in the proportions of the original windows and the quality of the stonework. What he could also see was that it was carrying the particular tiredness of a place maintained within means that no longer matched the original ambition. The gate needed paint. The south hedgerow had been trimmed on one side and allowed to go too long on the other. One shutter on the east wing hung at a slight angle, but the flower beds near the entrance were neatly tended, and the courtyard looked swept, and the overall impression was not abandonment but adjustment. This was a household that had adapted to reduced circumstances without losing its essential order. Then a carriage came around the bend ahead, at a speed that was entirely unreasonable for a shared country road. Owen pulled his horse sharply to the right with a grunt of annoyance. The carriage swept past them with 3 inches to spare, its wheel throwing a long fan of cold mud across the left side of the cart, and across Darius's boot, and up along his cloak. He had already moved before any of that happened. The moment the carriage sound reached him, and his mind processed what was approaching, he had dropped his chin toward his chest, and turned his face to the left, presenting the back of his hood to the passing vehicle. He did it in under a second, with the instinct of a man who had spent enough years in situations where a second was everything. He did it smoothly enough that Owen did not appear to notice any particular urgency in the movement. In the fraction of a second before he turned, he had seen the crest on the carriage door. He knew that crest with the automatic recognition of a man who had spent 11 years learning which symbols belonged to which houses. Lord Aldrich Pemberton, Senior Lord of the Eastern Province, guest at the Royal Palace twice in the past year, a man who had been personally introduced to King Darius Ashvale, and who had, on that occasion, looked directly and sustained into the king's face during the greeting. The carriage window had been open. Lord Pemberton had been looking out. The carriage was gone in 4 seconds. Its sound faded around the hill behind them. Owen wiped mud from his face with the back of his hand, and said something memorable about city carriages and their drivers' understanding of shared space. He looked sideways at Darius. "All right?" "Fine," Darius said. His voice was level. He was glad of that. The heart that had pushed once, hard, against his ribs, settled back to its normal rhythm over the next 100 paces. Darius breathed slowly and let the tension leave his body the way he had trained it to leave, deliberately, moving through it from the shoulders downward. He had come remarkably close to the entire plan ending before he had even arrived at the gate. He noted this, filed it, and moved forward. There was no useful thing to do with the near miss, except learn from it and continue. At the service entrance, the kitchen hit him first, with heat and the smell of bread and wood smoke, and something savory in a large pot over the fire. A woman with gray-streaked hair and the precise, economical movements of someone who had managed complex operations for many years was stirring that pot without looking up. She assessed him in approximately 3 seconds without fully turning around. "George Holt is in the east corridor," she said. "Down that hall, left at the end. Don't touch the shelves going past. They were cleaned this morning." This was Clara. He would learn her name within the first hour, and her reputation within the first day. She ran the Calwell kitchen with the total and quiet authority of a person who has long since stopped needing to announce her authority. He did not touch the shelves. George Holt was a lean, silver-haired man in his mid-50s, with the contained energy of someone who maintained a complex household by paying attention to everything all the time. He looked at Darius the way a careful craftsman looks at a piece of material he is considering using, assessing function rather than story. "You're the new hire?" "Yes, my name is Derek." George wrote the name down without comment. He had no particular interest in the name or the person it belonged to, only in whether the work would be done properly. He listed the week's duties in the manner of a man who believed efficiency was its own form of courtesy. Timber near the north barn. The garden gate latch, broken since February, mentioned with the thin exasperation of a man who had requested its repair through several channels without adequate result. Moss on the courtyard stones. Indoor work to follow if the outdoor work was done well. Room in the servants' block. East end. Second door. Dinner at 6. One more thing, George added, as Darius turned to go. Lady Seraphina uses the garden in the mornings. Be unobtrusive if you are working there. I will be, Darius said. The room in the servants' block was small in the specific way of rooms, designed for function rather than comfort. A single window, a narrow bed with a clean but much-washed coverlet, a small table and a hook on the wall. The room smelled of cedar and cold plaster. Darius set his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, and the mattress frame made an immediate, unashamed creak. He sat there for a moment in the particular quiet of a servant's quarters, which was a different quality of quiet from the main house, more functional, less performed, and let the reality of his situation settle over him. He had 7 days. 7 days before Fletcher would send the official royal messenger with the formal betrothal announcement, triggering the machinery of an arrangement the council had been building for months. 7 days to find out who Seraphina Calwell was, when she was simply a person moving through her own life. 7 days to answer the question the reports had not answered, which was the only question that actually mattered to him. He changed into work clothes and went to stack timber. The first morning was cold, and the work was harder on his hands than he had anticipated. His hands had spent too long doing work that required precision rather than strength, and the rough grain of the timber made that clear within the first half hour. He did not stop. He had never respected the particular defeat of choosing to stop, because something was harder than expected. He stacked timber steadily and paid attention to the sounds of the estate around him. He heard her for the first time before he saw her. He was on his third load to the north barn when raised voices came from the direction of the main house. Lord Edmund Calwell had a voice built for filling rooms, the voice of a man accustomed to making his points clearly and having them received without argument. He was speaking about tenant obligations and the importance of financial accountability, and what happened to a system of agreements when the agreements were not upheld. Then a woman's voice came back. It did not rise to match his. It held its own register, the register of normal conversation, and it was steady in a way that made the man's projecting voice seem slightly effortful by comparison. He has 4 children, she said, and a wife who was ill for most of the past winter. If you take his horses, he cannot plant in the spring. If he cannot plant, he loses the harvest. If he loses the harvest, he cannot pay the autumn lease in any case. So you will lose the same income either way, with the difference that your approach also destroys a family's livelihood in the process of losing it. That is not a sound approach. It is an impulse wearing the clothing of a strategy. A pause. Lord Edmund said her name in the tone of a man who expects this to be sufficient to end the matter. I am not yet finished, she said, at exactly the same register as before. No heat in it, just a statement. She finished. She laid out the practical alternative. Deferred partial payment to the end of the planting season, the balance extended to autumn, preserving both the income stream and a tenant with 11 years of demonstrated reliability. She said she was going to speak to the tenant directly, and she hoped that when she returned, there would be a practical decision in place. And then the sound of her footsteps, moving away from her father, not fast and not slow, finished, because the thing that needed to be said had been said. Darius stood in the cold morning with an armful of timber and breathed. He had heard thousands of arguments about land and payment and obligation in the course of his years as king. He had heard many of them made well and many made badly, and most made with some mixture of genuine reasoning and self-interest that was simply the natural flavor of political life. He had not often heard one made with that specific quality. Clean logic, no decoration, the complete absence of any performance. The conclusion identified and stated, and the conversation ended, not because anyone else agreed but because there was nothing further to add. He kept walking to the barn. That evening in the servants' hall, Nora, a young kitchen worker with an open, easy manner, mentioned without much preamble that Lady Seraphina had sat with her through an autumn illness. Just sat there with her own mending, she said. Did not make a thing of it. No one at the table responded as though this was surprising. It landed as confirmation of something they already knew. Darius ate his bread and stew and said nothing, and thought about the word pleasant sitting 3 times in the margins of a report written by a man who had apparently failed to notice what he was looking at. He lay on the narrow creaking bed that night and looked at the ceiling and thought about 7 days. He told himself the plan was clear and the timeline was defined, and he would gather what he needed and make a decision and return to the palace with actual information. He was already doubting that the 7 days was the piece of the plan that was going to matter. He was at the garden gate before 7 the following morning, with a new iron pin that George had provided without comment, a small hammer, and a file for the worn edges. The work required patience. The housing was old and had warped slightly over 2 winters of rain and hard freezes, and he needed to feel his way through the mechanism carefully to understand exactly where the pin needed to seat before he tried to force anything. He worked with deliberate slowness, crouching at the gate in the early morning chill, with the garden path stretching away behind him, toward the apple tree at the far end. He heard her coming before she reached the gate. Her footsteps on the stone path from the main house were quick and purposeful, the sound of someone with a clear destination and enough on her mind to fill the walk there. Darius did not look up. He kept his attention on the latch and let the footsteps approach and stop. "The gate is actually being fixed," she said. He looked up. She was standing at the entrance to the garden path, wearing a coat that was practical rather than fine, with a canvas bag over one shoulder, and her hair pulled back without particular arrangement. She was looking at the latch with an expression of uncomplicated and genuine surprise, as though she had expected it to continue being broken indefinitely, and was revising a long-held assumption. "I asked my father about it in March," she said. "He said he would look into it." "George sent me to it yesterday," Darius said. "George is more reliable than my father in most matters of practical maintenance," she said, without particular heat. "Just fact." She looked at the latch more closely. "Will it work properly when you are done?" "It will work the way it was supposed to work when it was first fitted," he said. She shifted the canvas bag to her other shoulder. "It has been dragging since before last winter," she said. "You stop noticing it after a while. You just compensate. Push the gate a particular way, because you know it will stick if you do not. When it is properly fixed, the compensation becomes the wrong movement." She looked at the gate, still speaking with the abstract quality of someone thinking aloud rather than conversing. "Things that were broken and have been repaired require an adjustment period. You have to stop doing the thing that used to work." Darius looked at her. "Things that get fixed can feel wrong at first," he said. She met his eyes for a brief moment, and something in her expression acknowledged that this sentence contained more than its literal meaning. "Yes," she said, "they can." She went through the open gate and down the garden path. He heard her settle among the beds at the far end, the sounds of someone who knew this garden well, doing the particular winter clearing work of early spring. He finished the latch. He tested it twice. It moved cleanly and silently, and with a definite, satisfying click. "It is done," he said. She looked up from the far bed. She watched him open the gate and close it. She listened to the sound it made. Not the old dragging sound, not the catch and release of a worn mechanism, but something clean and final and correct. She opened it herself and closed it, twice. "Thank you," she said. He picked up his tools and went back to the courtyard. George moved him inside that afternoon, to the east corridor windows. They needed the wooden frames cleaned of the fine residue that accumulated, where cold air moved through the old joins between glass and wood over a winter. It was detailed, careful work, and it put him inside the main house for the first time, moving through spaces that had a different quality from the service areas. He worked through the corridor slowly, aware that he was in territory where the household lived rather than worked, and that a different standard of unobtrusive applied here. He was at the third window when he heard her voice from the adjacent room. She was reading aloud, slowly and clearly. He understood why immediately when a second voice responded, a child's voice, careful and effortful, repeating a syllable back with the specific concentration of someone doing something genuinely hard and refusing to be defeated by it. "Sound the beginning," she said. "Don't try to take the whole word at once, just the first part." A pause, a careful syllable. "Exactly that," she said, with the warmth of someone who has been waiting for exactly that. "Now the next piece." Darius cleaned the window frame with careful, circular motions, and listened to the lesson continue through the wall without quite meaning to. He was not trying to listen specifically, he could not practically avoid it, but he found himself paying attention anyway, not to the words being worked through, but to the quality of the teaching. There was no impatience in her voice at any point. When the child made an error, she simply went back to the beginning of the word in the same voice she had used the first time, as though errors were simply part of the landscape of learning, and nothing about them required comment. He found out from Nora at dinner that the child was a boy named Kit, 12 years old, who had been in the kitchen staff for 4 months, and had come from circumstances that had not included a school, or anyone who thought his learning to read was important. Lady Seraphina had noticed within his first week. She had arranged to spend time with him 3 mornings each week, until he could manage on his own. "Does she often arrange things like that?" Darius asked, keeping the question light. "She doesn't arrange it," Nora said, with the small frown of someone being asked to explain something self-evident. "She just does it." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there a difference?" Nora looked at him. "Arranging it would mean she thought about whether it was practical first," she said. "She doesn't think about whether it's practical. She thinks Kit needs to learn to read, so she teaches him." She went back to her food. "That's the difference." On the 3rd morning, a courier came from the capital, with a leather satchel bearing administrative seals. He arrived before breakfast, which was early, and George met him at the main entrance, and carried the satchel directly to Lord Edmund's study, with the bearing of a man, for whom this was routine. The seals were administrative, not royal. A royal dispatch would have required more ceremony, and would have been preceded by an advance rider. But the sight of the sealed satchel made Darius's hand move without permission from his mind, reaching towards something that was not there, and was in any case not his to reach for. He caught himself. He pulled his hand back. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he believed no one had seen the movement, which was small and quickly corrected. But the fact that the instinct had appeared at all was information worth taking seriously. He went out to the courtyard pump and filled the morning barrel and focused on the physical simplicity of the task, until the instinct had settled back below the surface where it belonged. He was Derek here. Derek had no interest in sealed correspondence from the capital. Derek had not spent 11 years conditioning himself to treat sealed correspondence as the mechanism through which his days were structured and his decisions were documented. He was going to need to keep a more careful watch on himself. That afternoon, George assigned him to the low section of the east courtyard wall, where a stone had been working loose from its mortar for a season, and now shifted visibly when you pressed it. It needed to be pulled out, the old mortar cleared, the stone cleaned and reset. It was careful, satisfying work, and he was in the middle of it when he heard her footsteps coming across the courtyard. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the wall. "George is finding you a considerable amount to do," she said. "The estate appears to have accumulated some deferred maintenance," he said. She made a short sound that was not quite laughter, but contained the amusement that would produce it under slightly different circumstances. "That is a very diplomatic way of describing my father's relationship with practical problems," she said. She came closer and looked at the wall section he was working on. "How bad is this one?" "This stone, not very. The mortar dried out, and the stone worked loose. Resetting it is straightforward." He looked along the wall to the north corner, where the damage was more advanced. "The section past the corner there is more significant. 2 years, maybe, before you would need to replace a longer run of it." She followed his look with the specific attention of someone who was already doing the calculation of what that would cost and when. Her expression had the particular quality of a person who has done this calculation about many things over a long period of time, and has become very good at absorbing the result without showing what it costs her. "My father is not comfortable looking directly at problems," she said. "He has a theory that if they are not formally acknowledged, they continue to be potential problems rather than actual ones. In my experience," Darius said carefully, "problems that are not acknowledged tend to become more significant problems." "Yes," she said. "In mine too." She looked at the loose stone in his hands. "Can I help?" she said. He looked at her. He did not hide the small surprise quickly enough, and she saw it, and the amusement moved forward in her expression. "I have done this kind of thing before," she said. "I am not made of something fragile." "I did not think you were," he said. He handed her the trowel. She took it without making anything of the gesture, and crouched beside him at the wall. They worked together for the next 20 minutes, he setting the stone, she working the fresh mortar into the joins, with careful, even strokes, both of them quiet, in the companionable way of people doing a practical task together. She asked 2 questions about the technique. both of which were exactly the right questions, and demonstrated that she had done this before, and was refreshing her knowledge rather than learning it from the start. When the stone was set and the surface was pointed, she sat back on her heels and assessed the work. "Better," she said. "Better," he agreed. She stood. She wiped her hands on a cloth she had had in her coat pocket, which indicated she had planned to help before she said she was going to. She handed him back the trowel. "I am Seraphina," she said. It was said the way a person says their own name when they think the other person probably already knows it, and formality has gone on long enough. "I know," he said. "I am Derek." "I know," she said. George mentioned. "When you get to the north corner section, tell me first, before my father is informed. I want to know what condition it actually is in." "All right," he said. She went toward the kitchen garden. He watched her for a second, and then turned back to the wall. His hands were steady. His mind was not. He had come here to observe from a distance. That had been the plan: clean, controlled, a systematic gathering of information without direct involvement. He had not planned to crouch beside her at a wall with a trowel, or to have her tell him he was not making of something fragile when he had not yet said anything to suggest he thought she was. He had not planned to notice the cloth already in her coat pocket, or to feel the specific quality of working beside someone who asked the right questions and then was quiet. That evening he lay on the narrow bed and thought with unusual honesty about the gap between what he had planned to do here and what was actually happening. The gap was larger than he had anticipated. He was not certain whether that was a problem or not. He was certain that pretending not to notice it was not useful. He had 5 days left. He intended to use them. On the 4th morning, George assigned him to the upper house. The linen cabinet at the end of the family corridor needed to be restocked from the laundry stores in the east wing, and the 2 housemaids who usually managed the upper floor were occupied with preparations for a visiting land surveyor coming to meet with Lord Edmund. George handed Darius a stack of folded linens with brief, clear directions and sent him up. The family corridor was carpeted and quiet in a way the service areas were not. The light came through narrower windows and fell more softly, and the sound of his footsteps was absorbed before it could travel. He moved through it carefully. He found the cabinet where George had described it, a tall, dark wooden piece smelling faintly of lavender, and restocked the shelves in the order specified: bed linens above, smaller household pieces below. He worked methodically. He made no unnecessary sound. He was done in under 5 minutes. He closed the cabinet. He turned to go back down the corridor. He heard his name. Not Derek. His real name. Darius. The sound stopped him before any part of his mind had decided to stop. His foot simply did not move forward. His hand was still on the cabinet door. The voice was Seraphina's, coming through a door standing open by no more than 2 or 3 inches, and she had just spoken the full name of the King of Ironmore, into a room she believed held only herself and her handmaid. He should have walked on. That was entirely clear to him. He was in a private corridor in a private house, and the conversation on the other side of that door was not intended for him, and there was no version of what was about to happen that could be called anything other than something he should not be doing. He did not walk on. King Darius Ashvale, Seraphina said, is a man who has spent 11 years acquiring power, and appears never to have seriously considered what happens to a person once he acquires them. A second voice, gentler, measured, Mira, the handmaid, whom Darius had seen briefly twice in the past several days. Sarah. The single word carried the particular weight of someone who understands a person very well and uses their name as a full and gentle warning. "I know," Seraphina said. "I know my voice is carrying. I am keeping it even. I need to say this somewhere, and you are the only place available." "Then say it," Mira said quietly. The sound of fabric. Someone settling more completely into a chair. "I have read everything available about him," Seraphina said. "The official correspondence and the unofficial accounts. The reports from the provincial summits that came through my father's desk. The letters his council sent over the past year, relating to the province." A pause. "He is not a cruel man, as far as the evidence shows. He does not appear to enjoy the suffering of other people. He is a man of systems. He takes things that are not working efficiently, and he makes them work. Roads, treaties, military positioning, agricultural policy. Everything he touches either improves or is corrected. By most measures, he is exactly the kind of king a kingdom needs. That sounds like admiration, Mira said carefully. It is a description, Serafina said. Admiration of a quality is not the same as wanting to live inside the expression of it. A machine that runs well is admirable. I do not want to be a component of a machine. She stopped. He will look at this alliance the way he looks at everything, as a variable to be correctly positioned. I will be the variable. Once I am positioned, the system will run, and he will turn his attention to the next thing that requires positioning. The room was quiet for a moment. You cannot know that, Mira said. I know it from 11 years of watching what he does and how he does it, Serafina said. There is no record of him changing his approach for a person. There is a very consistent record of him changing people's situations to fit the approach. Another pause. I am not able to explain why I find that frightening without sounding foolish. A comfortable, secure position with a man who is not cruel and keeps his kingdom in good order. Most people would say I was mad to object. And yet, Mira said. And yet, Serafina said. A silence, longer this time. The kind of silence that exists on one side of a decision that has already been made and is waiting to be stated. I wrote to Aunt Prudence 3 weeks ago, Serafina said, before the council letter arrived. I knew the arrangement was coming, and I wrote to ask whether her standing offer was still open. The property management in the north. She replied yesterday. It is. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then, Sarah. I know what it means, Serafina said. I know what my father will say, and what the council will say, and what the political implications are. I am not doing this carelessly. I have thought about it for months, and I have thought about it from every direction, and the conclusion is the same every time. If I stay and allow this arrangement to proceed without any agency in it, I will have accepted the premise that the arrangement of my life is not my business. Her voice remained even throughout. I cannot accept that premise. I don't know how to live inside it. Where will you go? Mira asked. When? I need 2 more days, Serafina said. I have things I am not leaving unfinished. Then I will go to the north, before the official banquet, before he arrives to look at me. The last sentence was said in a tone that was not bitter, but was very specific. I will not be looked at like that. I will not stand in front of him and be assessed and approved or not approved. I am a person, not a ledger entry. Mira said nothing for a long moment. Then, I am coming with you. Of course you are, Serafina said. Darius stood in the family corridor with his back against the wall, and the linen smell of the clean cabinet around him, and his breathing completely still. He had not moved since he heard his name. He stood inside the conversation, happening 3 inches away from him, and he did not move. She was going to leave. In 2 days, before the banquet, before he arrived. He pressed the flat of his hand against the corridor wall and thought about what he had just heard, with the specific kind of honesty that is only available in moments when there is no audience and nothing to be gained by softening the truth. She had called him a man who positioned people like variables in a system. She had said he looked at alliances as components to be correctly placed and then turned his attention to the next thing. She had said that 11 years of watching what he did and how he did it had produced a consistent picture, and the picture was a man who changed situations to fit his approach rather than the reverse. He thought about the council room. He thought about the folder. He thought about the meeting in which the council had placed the arrangement in front of him, and he had read the reports and noted their inadequacy, and said he would consider the matter, and then had spent 4 months considering it in exactly the way he considered everything, from the outside, with the systematic attention of a man looking at a system rather than at a person. She was not wrong. That was the thought he could not move past. She had arrived at an accurate picture of him using nothing but second-hand accounts and correspondence, and the accuracy of it was not comforting. He had been observed precisely by a person who had no access to him at all, and what that observation had produced was a description of a man he was not proud to recognize. He pushed off the wall. He walked back down the corridor with as much quiet as he could manage. He went down the stairs and through the kitchen without meeting anyone's eyes, and out into the cold afternoon air of the courtyard. He walked to the far side of the courtyard, and stood with his back to the estate, and his face toward the stone wall of the outbuilding, and breathed. She was going to leave in 2 days. He had been here for 4 days. He had 3 days remaining in his original plan, and she was going to be gone before the end of them. He could go inside right now and tell the truth. That was the obvious action. request an audience with Lord Edmund, remove the disguise, let everything come back to its correct order. The arrangement would proceed. She would have no practical means of stopping it once the king himself was present. He stood against the cold wall and thought about why he could not do that. The reason he could not do that was not strategic. It was not about the arrangement or the province or the council's satisfaction. It was that she had just said, in a private room to the person she trusted most, that she was afraid of being positioned and assessed, and looked at like a ledger entry by a man who treated people as components of a system. And if he walked inside right now, and revealed himself, and let the machinery of the arrangement proceed, he would be proving every word of that assessment correct. He was not willing to do that. He needed her to know that there was a difference between what she had read about him and what he actually was. He was not entirely certain that there was such a difference. The fact that he was not entirely certain was itself a piece of information worth sitting with. He stayed at the wall until the light changed and the kitchen sounds began, and then he went in for dinner and sat in the warm, noisy hall and ate his food and said almost nothing and thought about a woman in a chair telling her handmaid why she had already arranged to leave, and the specific tone of someone who has found a way forward and intends to use it. He had 3 days, she had 2. He was going to need to be very careful about what he did next. On the 5th morning, he made a decision. He had been awake for an hour before the estate stirred, lying on the narrow bed with the dark ceiling above him, and the wind outside the small window, and the specific quality of thought that comes at 4 in the morning, when a problem has been present long enough to show its real shape. He had thought about what she had said. He had thought about his options. He had thought about what each option would produce and at whose cost. The decision he arrived at was this: he was not going to reveal himself yet. He was not going to let her leave. And he was not going to manage this from the outside any longer. He was going to have a real conversation with her. Not a conversation that pushed an agenda. Not a conversation designed to change her mind by strategy. A real one, where he was as much himself as he could be while still being Derek, and where he listened to her the way he should have been listening from the beginning, not to gather information, but because she was a person worth listening to. If she met him and found she could not stand him, he was prepared to tell the council that the arrangement was not workable. He had never said this to a council before. He found, at 4 in the morning, in the dark of the servants' block, that he was prepared to say it now. He got up, he dressed, he went to work. George had assigned him to the stable for the afternoon, because the regular stable hand was managing a lame horse in the east paddock, and the 2 working horses needed exercise. Darius took the assignment and went at noon, leading the first horse, a gray named Marcus, out of the stable and into the main paddock. He walked Marcus through his paces with the ease of a man who had spent more time around horses than most, and he let the afternoon settle around him and waited. He heard her footsteps on the paddock path before she came around the corner. She stopped at the fence and stood watching him for a moment without speaking. He brought Marcus toward the fence on the circuit, and the horse dipped his head immediately toward her, with the recognition of an animal that knows a specific person and is glad to see them. She put out her hand, and Marcus pushed his nose into her palm. "He was mine," she said, "before he was the estate's." "Owen told me," Darius said. She looked at him. "Owen, the grain delivery man? He gave me a ride from the village," Darius said. "He mentioned you were good with horses." She returned her attention to Marcus, scratching lightly between his eyes, in the way the horse clearly considered the correct way to be touched. "He was mine from when I was 14, she said. "I trained him myself. In those years, Marcus and I were both rather determined and rather badly behaved, and we suited each other." She did not say anything for a moment. 2 years ago, my father restructured the estate finances. Marcus became estate property. "He still knows you," Darius said. "Animals have a different kind of memory," she said. "They remember how a person made them feel. They do not particularly care about the category the person has been placed in since then." She stepped back from the fence, which is sometimes a more sensible approach than the one we take. He walked Marcus back around the paddock. She stayed at the fence. He could feel her watching him with the same careful, uncalculated attention she gave to everything. "You are good with him," she said. "I have spent time around horses," he said. "How much time?" He considered the most honest answer available to him within the constraints he was operating under. "Most of my life," he said. She was quiet for a moment. You do not ride like a person who spent his life managing someone else's horses, she said. He kept Marcus moving and did not respond immediately. This was the specific edge he had been approaching since the second day, the place where the gap between what he looked like and what he actually was had grown wide enough to be visible. She was too observant to miss it indefinitely. He had known that. He was not fully prepared for how quickly she had arrived at it. I manage things, he said, for people with authority. I spent time around the things that mattered to them. She said nothing. He could feel her considering that answer and finding it incomplete. You are going to tell me that a household servant does not usually speak like someone who has been managing things for people with authority, he said. I was thinking about it, she said. He brought Marcus to the fence again. He looked at her directly. I have not lied to you about anything, he said, which was the truest available sentence. I have not told you everything. She held his gaze. Her expression was that particular quality of undiluted attention, not hostile, not soft, just very present. Most people haven't told me everything, she said. That is the ordinary condition of conversation. What I notice is whether the things a person does not tell me are the things that would change what I have understood. A pause. Those are the ones that matter. He said nothing. She looked at Marcus, who was tolerating the fence conversation with the patient dignity of a horse, who had decided this was now his designated standing spot. I am going to trust you with something, she said. Not because I am certain you have earned it, but because I think you are someone who will do something useful with it. All right, he said. I am not going to the banquet, she said. I am leaving before it. I have made arrangements. She looked at him. I am telling you this because if you are here next week, and people ask where I have gone, I would rather you know the truth, and be able to decide for yourself what to say, than have you caught in the middle of something you did not understand. He stood at the fence with one hand on Marcus's neck and the cold afternoon air around him, and he thought about the quality of trust it took to tell a person you had known for 5 days something this significant. He thought about what she was trusting him with and why she had decided to trust him with it. Why, he said. Why am I telling you? Yes. She thought about it honestly. Because you fixed the gate, she said. Because you crouched beside me at the wall and asked the right question about the mortar. Because you have been here for 5 days and you have not once tried to tell me what I should think. She paused. And because you are carrying something that you are not telling me, and I have decided that the fact that you are carrying it carefully is more important right now than knowing what it is. He was quiet for a long moment. I would ask you not to go, he said at last. She looked at him. Not to tell you what you should do, he said. Just to ask. I would ask you not to go yet. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of two people on either side of a significant moment, both of them aware of it, and neither of them pretending otherwise. Why? She said. Because I think something is about to be lost that does not need to be lost, he said. And I am not in a position to explain that more clearly right now. But I am asking. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked at Marcus, who had dropped his nose toward the grass along the paddock fence with the magnificent indifference of an animal who had made peace with human complications long ago. I will think about it, she said. She walked back toward the house. He watched her go, and then turned Marcus back around the paddock, and kept walking, because the horse needed the exercise regardless of everything else, and because walking beside a horse in a paddock was a useful thing to do, when one needed to think, and did not have access to any of the ordinary places one thought. She had told him she was leaving. She had told him because she trusted him with it. She had said she would think about staying because he had asked her to. He had not told her who he was. The weight of that was specific and uncomfortable, and he carried it through the rest of the afternoon and through dinner and into the evening, sitting in the servants' hall with the noise of the household around him, and Nora's cheerful account of something that had happened with the kitchen cat, and George's expression of measured disapproval about the standard of the East Corridor cleaning, and all of it going on around him, while he sat inside the fact that he was going to have to tell her before another day passed. He was done waiting for the right moment. He was going to create it. She was in the garden the next morning when he arrived. He had not been certain she would still be there. The possibility that she had simply gone, packed her things in the night and started for the north before the estate was awake, had been present in his mind since the previous evening, and he had checked the courtyard from the servants' block window before he went to work, looking for the signs of a departure without quite knowing what he was looking for. She was on the bench at the far end of the garden, not reading, just sitting with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned toward the apple tree above her. She had the private expression again, the one that appeared when she was not managing anything for anyone. He went to the north wall and started the work George had listed for him there. He did not go directly to her. He worked his way down the wall, checking the joins, identifying the sections that needed attention, and he let the garden hold them both in its morning quiet. After a while she said, without turning, "You came back." "I work here," he said. "I meant," she said, "that you came back this morning specifically, to check whether I was still here." He stopped working. He looked at her. She was still facing the apple tree, but she was aware of him, the way she was always aware of things in the space around her, without appearing to track them. "Yes," he said. She turned then. She looked at him across the garden with that clear, unguarded attention. "Why does it matter to you whether I am here?" she said. He chose honesty over the careful answer. "Because I asked you to stay," he said, "and I wanted to know whether you had." She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the tree. "I am still deciding," she said. He went back to the wall. The morning settled around them, the thin spring light moving across the garden beds as the sun came through the cloud cover in stages, and the sound of the estate going about its business beyond the gate, and the two of them in the garden with the apple tree between them, in the sense that it was above them both. "What do you want your life to be?" she asked eventually. He looked up. "I am sorry?" "Your life," she said. She was still looking at the tree. "What do you want it to be? Not what it is, what you want it to be." He thought about this with genuine care, setting aside the reflexive answer that a king would give, setting aside the answer that Derek, the household worker, might give. He thought about what he actually wanted, which was something he had not been asked in long enough that the question had a slightly unfamiliar shape. "I want to be useful," he said, "in ways that matter, not efficient. That is a different thing. I want to be in situations where what I do changes something real for real people. And I want—" He stopped. "And you want what?" she said. "I want to be spoken to honestly," he said, "by someone who is not performing for me." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That is a lonely thing to want if you have not been getting it." "It is," he said. She looked at him. "What is it you do, Derek, that makes honest conversation so scarce?" He met her eyes. "I am in a position that makes people careful," he said. "Most positions of authority do that," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him with the specific expression of someone who is assembling a picture from pieces and has just placed another piece and found it fit better than expected. "What kind of authority?" she said. He looked back at her steadily. "The kind that requires me to think about everything before I say it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with a change in her voice that was subtle but entirely clear, "I have been thinking about the king." He said nothing. He kept his face still. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I said to Mira, about what kind of man he is." She turned to face him fully now. "I said those things because I believed them. I still believe them. But I have been thinking that I have never met him. I have never spoken to him. I have built a picture from records and accounts and other people's impressions, and I have treated that picture as though it were the person." She paused. "That is exactly the kind of thing I criticize in other people. The picture may be accurate," Darius said carefully. "The picture may be accurate," she agreed. "Or it may be an accurate picture of how he has appeared in the situations he has been in, which is not the same as who he is." She looked at the garden beds. "I know the difference between those two things when it applies to myself. I ought to apply the same care to other people." He was very still. "I am not saying I will go to the banquet," she said. "I am saying that I have been thinking about whether I have been fair, and I am not certain that I have." She looked at him. "That is an uncomfortable thing to admit." "It is," he said, "and it is an honest thing to admit." She was quiet for a moment. "You are a strange person," she said. "You have said that before." "I keep arriving at the same conclusion," she said. "That is usually a sign it is accurate." He smiled, despite himself. It was a real one, not managed, and she saw it, and her expression did something in response. A small, private thing, not quite a smile but the quality of it. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said. Something that is not about the work. He thought about it seriously. I have spent a very long time doing what seemed necessary, he said, without always understanding whether it was also what was good. She held his gaze. Is there a difference? I believe there is, he said. I am still working out how large the difference is. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the apple tree again, and said, It blooms in the 3rd week of spring, every year. My mother planted it. A pause. I would like to see it bloom this year. I am not certain I will. That depends on what you decide, he said. Yes, she said. It does. She stood up from the bench and gathered her shawl around her shoulders. She looked at him one more time, with that complete, unguarded attention. I have not yet decided, she said, but I am still here. That should tell you something. She went back toward the house. He watched her go, and then turned to the wall, and put his hands on the stone, and stood there for a moment, with his palms flat against the cold surface, and thought about what he had just been handed, and what he intended to do with it. She was reconsidering. It was not certainty, but she was reconsidering, and she had told him she was reconsidering, and those were different things from the conversation he had been braced for. He had one more day before he had to tell her the truth, perhaps less. He could feel it, the way the gap between who he was and who he was pretending to be was visible now, not because he had made obvious errors, but because she was too perceptive to keep not noticing it. She was already pulling the threads loose without quite knowing that was what she was doing. He was going to need to tell her before she finished pulling them herself. On the afternoon of the 6th day, the rain came. It arrived without much warning, a darkening of the sky that moved fast from the northwest, and then the smell of it in the air before the first drops, and then the drops themselves, cold and steady and suddenly everywhere. Darius was working on the courtyard stones when it started, and he moved the tools quickly under the overhang of the north barn, and stood there watching the courtyard fill with rain. George appeared in the kitchen doorway, and called that anyone still outside should come in. Darius came in. He went to the small room that George used as a supply station, and hung up the damp outer cloak, and found something else to do with his hands, while he waited to see what the afternoon held. George sent him to the library. The upper shelves needed work, George said. Dust from the winter had settled on the spines of the books on the highest run, and someone needed to go through them with a cloth. It was work that could be done in the rain since it was indoors, and it would otherwise not get done until spring cleaning, and George appeared to find the accumulation of deferred dust personally offensive. He gave Darius a cloth and a lamp and sent him up. The library was at the back of the house on the upper floor, and it smelled of old paper, and the particular dry warmth of rooms kept slightly heated in winter, to protect what they contained. Darius had been in state libraries, palace archives, collections curated by royal historians with significant resources. This was none of those things. It was a medium-sized room, with floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, and a long table in the center, with 2 chairs pulled up to it, and it had the specific quality of a room that was used seriously, rather than decoratively. The books were organized with clear logic. Several shelves had handwritten labels. On the table was a glass of water with a bookmark beside it, and the bookmark was in a book about land survey methods in the Northern Territories. He set the lamp on the table and unfolded the rolling ladder from its hook and began on the top shelf. He was on the 3rd section of the top run when the door opened. She came in with a book tucked under one arm, and stopped when she saw him on the ladder. She looked at him. She looked at the cloth in his hand, and the lamp on her table, and the rolled-up carpet in the corner that he had moved to give the ladder room. George sent you in here, she said. Dust on the upper shelves, he said. She looked up at the top run of shelves. She looked at the section he had already cleared, where the spines were now visible without the winter film. He has never sent anyone in here, she said. He says I keep it in adequate order. The top shelf is not in adequate order, Darius said. She came in and set her book on the table and looked up at him on the ladder. There was the small movement in her expression that preceded her specific kind of amusement. You are doing him a service he did not know he was asking for, she said. It needed to be done, he said. She pulled one of the chairs back from the table and sat down. Not in the reading position, but in the sideways position of someone who has arrived in a space they think in, rather than simply read in. She opened her book but did not begin reading it. Do you like libraries? She said, after a moment. Yes, he said. What do you like about them? He considered this. The honesty of them, he said. The books say what they have to say, whether anyone is in the room or not. There is no performance required. He moved the ladder along the rail to the next section, and the accumulation of it, the sense that the conversations people have had with the best ideas they could find, are all present in the room at once. She was quiet for a moment. That is an unusual way to think about a library, she said. Is it wrong? No, she said. It is more right than the way most people think about it. Most people think about libraries as places that contain information. You are saying it is a place that contains thought. Those are different things, he said. Yes, she said, they are. She looked down at her book, but she was still in the sideways thinking position, rather than the reading one. He kept working through the top shelf, moving steadily, and the rain came against the windows steadily, and the lamp made the room warm and amber in the gray afternoon. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said. What would you do if you could do anything? She said. Not what you have done, not what you are doing. What would you do if the situation were entirely open? He was quiet for a long moment, balanced on the ladder with the cloth in his hand, and the question underneath him. I would change how decisions are made, he said. Not what decisions are made, necessarily. How? I would put the people who live inside the consequences of a decision in the same room as the people who make the decision, before the decision is made. I think almost every failure of governance I have ever seen comes from the same place. The people with the authority, and the people with the actual knowledge of the situation, are never in the same room at the same time. She had gone completely still. He came down the ladder one step. He looked at her. She was looking at him with an expression that was not the thoughtful looking at him expression he had seen before. This one was different, more specific, more alert. You said that before, she said carefully. Essentially, in different words. In the corridor conversation about the window frames, about the estate management problems. He kept his expression easy. It is something I think about often, he said. People who think about governance, she said slowly, are usually people who are involved in it. She held his gaze. What kind of work did you do before this, Derek? Really? He met her eyes. He was balanced on the second rung of the library ladder in the lamplight, with the rain on the windows and the old books around them, and she was looking at him with the specific focused attention of a person who has arrived at the edge of something and is deciding whether to step over it. Important work, he said. The kind where a wrong answer has large consequences. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you still doing it? She said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I am. She held that for a moment, and he could see her putting pieces together, each small thing that had not quite added up, each moment where the gap between who he appeared to be and what he actually said, or knew, or did, had been a little too wide. He could see her building toward the question he was not ready for her to ask in this room, in this lamplit afternoon, before he had chosen the moment. He came down the ladder. He picked up the lamp. May I show you something? He said. She looked slightly surprised by the change of direction. All right, she said. He carried the lamp to the far wall, to a section of shelving he had noticed when he first came in. He pointed to a book on the middle shelf, a thin green volume, well worn, pressed between two larger texts. She crossed the room and looked at where he was pointing. She reached up and took the book down. It was the taxation analysis of the eastern provinces, the one she had mentioned in the previous weeks. She turned it over in her hands. This is one of the most useful books in this room, she said. I have read it 3 times. I know, he said. I could tell from the binding. She looked at him. Have you read it? He paused 1/2 second too long. Yes, he said. The silence that came after that was specific. She looked at the book in her hands, and then at him, and then back at the book, and he could see the moment in which the piece fit. Not all the pieces, not the full picture, but enough of it that she was suddenly much more still than she had been a moment before. Derek, she said. Yes. Who are you? The question sat in the lamplight between them. The rain came against the windows. The book said nothing, because they never did. He looked at her with the specific kind of attention he had spent 6 days learning to recognize when she turned it on him, and he thought about what was right to say, and what was not yet the moment for. And he thought about her on the bench telling him she was still deciding, and the apple tree, and 2 days she had said she had before she would leave. Someone, he said, who needs one more day before I can answer that properly. She looked at him for a long time. He did not look away. All right, she said at last. One more day. She put the book back on the shelf in its exact place. She gathered her things from the table. She walked to the door and paused. The work you are doing, she said, without turning. Up there on the shelves. You are doing it the way you do everything, very carefully and very precisely, as though whatever is in front of you deserves to be done exactly right. She opened the door. I noticed that on the first day, I have been thinking about what kind of person that indicates. She went out. The door closed behind her. He stood in the lamplight with the rain on the windows, and the old books, and the cloth still in his hand. He thought about one more day. He thought about what one more day had to contain, and how he was going to say the true thing, in a way that she could hear it. He put the lamp back on the table. He went back up the ladder, and finished the last section of the top shelf. He worked until the light in the room shifted from amber to gray, and the rain slowed against the windows. And then he put the tools away and went downstairs and thought about tomorrow, with a particular and complicated clarity. Not Fletcher's planned messenger, the official one with the formal sealed announcement. This one was early, sent ahead by the Palace Administration Department, with a letter to Lord Edmund, confirming the logistical details of the arriving royal party, and requesting confirmation of the estate's readiness to receive the banquet guests. He arrived before breakfast, coming through the front gate on a horse with a satchel bearing the royal seal, and the sound of it was different from the administrative courier who had come before. Darius was near the front courtyard when the messenger came through. He heard the gate, he heard the horse. He heard the shift in the household around him as the royal seal was processed. The quick, alert, slightly anxious adjustment of people who understand that the arrival of something bearing a king's seal changes the immediate character of where they are. George intercepted the messenger at the door and carried the letter inside with his most formal posture, which was noticeably more formal than his everyday posture. Darius went to the barn and stayed there for a while doing unnecessary things with a saddle that did not need attention, giving himself time to think. The letter had reached Lord Edmund before breakfast. He knew this because by the time the morning meal was finished and the household began its work for the day, there was a new quality in the air of the estate, the particular tension of preparation for something significant. Clara came into the kitchen from a meeting with Lord Edmund and began making a list of provisions on a scale she did not usually consider. George moved through the upper house with a heightened focus. 2 of the housemaids were sent to open the formal reception rooms, which had been closed since the autumn. He came out of the barn in the late morning to find the courtyard already rearranged around the upcoming event. The main gate had been rehung. He had not done that. Someone else had. And the path from the gate to the front entrance had been cleared of the last of the winter debris. The estate was transforming itself from a working household into a household preparing to be seen. He found Seraphina in the kitchen garden. She was standing at the wall with her arms folded, and her face turned slightly downward, and the expression that appeared when she was managing something internal and doing it quietly. She was not doing garden work. She was simply standing there, which was unusual for her. He had not, in 7 days, seen her simply stand still in the open. He went to work on the section of wall near the garden gate. There was always something near the gate that could use attention, and he gave her the space of not approaching directly. After a while she said, without looking at him, "You knew this was coming." He kept his hands on the wall. "What do you mean?" "The messenger from the palace," she said. "When I came out here, and you were already at the gate, you had a specific quality of knowing where you were going, and why." She looked at him now. "You knew the royal messenger was there." He looked at the wall, and thought about the most honest available answer. "I was aware of the timing," he said. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of someone replacing a working assumption with a new one, and discovering the new one has significant implications. "Aware of the timing," she said. "Yes." She looked at him with an expression that was very still and very focused. "How long have you been here?" 7 days, he said. "How long did you plan to be here?" He turned to face her. He had been going to do this tonight. He had decided last night that he was going to tell her tonight, in the garden, in the evening, when there was enough time and enough quiet to let the truth land properly. He had had a plan. He looked at her face, that specific focus, that particular quality of trying to see the real thing rather than what she expected, and he understood that waiting until tonight was not the right choice. "I came here a week ago," he said, "under a name that is not my name, to find out something the reports given to me did not cover." The stillness in her face deepened. "What reports?" she said. "Reports about you," he said. "Written by people who came here and observed this household and wrote down what they saw and sent the documents back to me so that I could make a decision about an arrangement I was not willing to make based on documents alone." Her face was doing the specific thing that faces do when a large piece of information is arriving and the brain is doing the work of understanding what it means for everything that has come before it. He had told himself he was going to say this cleanly and without complication. He was finding that it was very hard to say cleanly. "What arrangement?" she said. He held her gaze. "The betrothal," he said. "The arrangement between your family and the crown." "You are from the palace," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "You were sent here," she said, still working through it, "by the king, to observe me before the formal meeting." He was quiet, for exactly the length of time it took him to decide that any further pause was a form of dishonesty. "I was not sent by the king," he said. "I am the king." The garden held the words for a moment. The apple tree moved in the small wind. The gate was closed and solid on its repaired latch. Somewhere in the main house, someone was moving furniture for the reception rooms. Serafina looked at him. She did not speak. She did not move. She looked at him with the complete, focused attention she had always brought to things she was trying to understand, and he could see her doing it, moving through every conversation they had had, every moment, everything she had said, and everything he had said in response, and understanding now what all of it had contained. He watched her face. He had prepared himself for anger. He had thought about what anger would look like, and how he would respond to it. He had thought about what refusal would look like, or accusation, or the hard, bright outrage of someone who has been deceived and is naming it clearly. What he had not prepared for was what he actually saw. Her face went inward. It went quiet, in the specific way of someone absorbing something they had not expected to absorb, something that had been offered as one thing and turned out to be another, and the loss of that first version was not yet anger, because it had not yet finished being grief. She breathed in very slowly. "I see," she said. She turned and walked back down the stone path to the house. Her steps were precise and even, and she held herself with absolute posture, which was the way she carried herself when she was managing something she did not want to show. "Serafina," he said. She did not stop. "Please," he said. She was at the gate. She opened it. The latch moved cleanly, easily, the pin seating firmly, the way it had not moved for almost a year before he fixed it, and she went through and let it close behind her. He stood at the end of the path beside the apple tree. The gate was between them now. She was gone. The estate continued its preparations around him, completely unaware of what had just happened in the garden between a king and the woman who had just walked away from him. He stayed where he was for a while. The wind moved through the apple tree above him, and the thin morning light was flat and cold, and the world was going on around him with its normal purposeful energy, and none of it was relevant to the single fact that she had walked away with her face turned inward, and he had no way to follow without making things worse. He had 7 days. He had used them exactly as he intended, and arrived at a conversation he had not handled well, because the moment had not been the moment he planned, and he had still been working out the words when the situation demanded they already be found. He walked back across the courtyard. He went to the barn. He sat on a low bench just inside the door, and looked at the dusty interior, and thought about what came next. He had tonight. Tonight, he was going to find a way to be in front of that door. The evening preparation in the Calwell estate, the night before the banquet, was the kind of controlled chaos that well-run households produce when they are doing too many things at once. Clara was in the kitchen, directing provisions. George was in the upper house with 2 of the housemaids and a list of things that needed to happen before morning. Lord Edmund was in his study with a provincial magistrate who had arrived midday, discussing the appropriate ceremony for receiving the royal party. The estate was moving entirely around the axis of tomorrow and its requirements, and no one had any attention to spare for anything else. This suited Darius very well. He had spent the afternoon after the garden in a state of focused preparation. He did not have a plan in the sense of a document with steps. He had a sequence, what needed to happen, in what order, and why. He had refined this sequence in the barn and at the timber pile and over dinner, where he ate without tasting anything and said nothing at all, which Nora noticed and commented on with characteristic directness by asking him if he was feeling unwell. Not unwell, he said, thinking. Thinking as hard as you're thinking usually means trouble, Nora said. Yes, he said, usually. He went to his room after dinner. He changed out of the work clothes into the plain, dark clothes that had arrived the previous evening, sent by Fletcher on the back of the information Darius had transmitted through the courier, the clothes of a man with authority rather than a man without any. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at his hands and thought about what he was going to say. He went to the main house near the 10th hour. The household had quieted by then. The kitchen was dark. The lower corridors were empty. He went up the stairs quietly, which he was practiced at by now, and went to the family corridor. Serafina's door was the second on the left. He had known this from his first day in the house, which was one of the things he had made sure to know. He stood outside the door. He raised his hand and knocked. 2 quiet, deliberate knocks. Footsteps. Not Serafina's. Lighter. Quicker. Mira opened the door and looked at him, and her expression moved through several things in rapid sequence. Recognition of who he was, in the ordinary sense, and then a different recognition, the kind that arrives when you are being looked at by someone, and you suddenly understand which someone it actually is. She looked at him for a long moment. Her face was calm, but extremely alert. You should go, she said quietly. I am not going to, he said. I would like to speak to her. Through the door if she prefers. Mira looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped back and partially closed the door. He heard her moving inside, and then a low exchange of voices, too quiet to make out. Then quiet. Then Mira came back. She did not open the door fully. She stood at the gap and looked at him. She will hear you, Mira said, through the door. She stepped back, and the door swung almost closed. He put his hand flat against the wood of the door for a moment, not to knock, just to feel the solid fact of where he was and what he intended to do. I came here, he said, because the reports I was given about you were written by men who looked at you and saw what they expected to see. The folder that my counsel put in front of me contained your name and your family's situation, and 3 pages of impressions, and none of it told me anything about who you actually are. He paused. I was going to walk into a formal banquet and be introduced to you for the first time with my title, in the room between us and 50 people watching, and I had no idea whether you were a person I could stand beside for the rest of my life. I found that I could not accept that. The door was closed. He could not see her. He could feel the room on the other side of the wood, the quiet of it, the fact of her inside it, listening or not listening. So I came here instead, he said, as no one, and I heard things that were hard to hear. He breathed. I heard you tell Mira that I run a kingdom like a counting house, and that everyone in my life is a number in a column. I heard you say that you were afraid of being positioned and assessed, like a variable in a system I was already running. I heard you say that you were going to leave before the banquet, because you could not live inside the premise that the arrangement of your own life was not your business. Silence. I want to tell you that I heard all of that. I want to tell you that I did not dismiss it, or explain it away, or fold it into a different category. I want to tell you that it was the truest thing anyone has said about me in years, and that it landed the way true things land when you have been avoiding them, with the specific weight of something you already knew. He stopped. He put his other hand on the doorframe, steadying himself in the ordinary physical way of a person who needs to say something difficult and uses the solidity of the nearest available thing to help. Everything that happened in the last 7 days, he said, was real. The conversation at the wall, the gate, the library, the things you trusted me with. All of it was real on my side. I was not performing anything. I was not gathering information in the way a report writer gathers information. I was just present, with you, in the way I have not been present with anyone in a long time. He stopped. I know that does not undo what I did. I know I deceived you, and I know it is not a small thing to be deceived by someone you trusted. I am not asking you to skip past that. I am just asking you to know that the person you were talking to was not entirely an invention. The door said nothing. He was about to say one more thing, the last thing, the one he had decided was the most important, when her voice came through the door. It was quiet. It was steady. It had the quality of something she had decided to say despite uncertainty, which was its own kind of courage. "Was any of it real?" she said. "For you. Not the mission of it, not the information gathering of it. Was any of it actually real?" He leaned slightly against the door frame. "All of it," he said. "Every piece of it." A long silence. He waited. He was a man who was good at waiting, and he waited now, with the full force of that, letting the silence hold, without trying to fill it. "Good night, Darius," she said. Not Derek. His real name. His actual name, in her voice, through a door in a corridor, in an estate he had come to and borrowed clothes 7 days ago. He stepped back from the door. "Good night," he said. He went back down the corridor, and down the stairs. He went out into the cold night air of the courtyard, and stood there for several minutes, with the stars out above the estate, and the kitchen dark, and the estate quiet around him, in the specific way it went quiet late at night, when all the work was done, and the people inside it were resting. She had called him by his real name. She had not opened the door, but she had called him by his real name, and she had said good night rather than go away, and those two things together were not nothing. He walked back to the servants' block. He lay on the narrow bed for the last time. The banquet was in the morning. He did not know what was going to happen at the banquet. He did not know what she was going to decide. He closed his eyes. He thought about the apple tree. He thought about the 3rd week of spring. He was still thinking about it when he fell asleep. The morning of the banquet came with a clear, cold sky, and the kind of light that makes everything look both precise and significant, as though the world is making an effort. Darius was dressed before the household woke. Not in the work clothes of the past 7 days, and not in the plain clothes he had put on for the corridor conversation, but in the traveling clothes that Fletcher had arranged to be sent. Dark blue wool, with a formal collar, the quality of material that announces a person without requiring him to say anything about himself. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a moment, looking at the small room one more time. The hook on the wall, the table, the window with the view of the stone wall, the coverlet that had been washed many times. He got up. He folded the coverlet neatly and set it at the foot of the bed. He did this without entirely knowing why. The estate was already moving when he came out. Clara's kitchen was lit and loud and producing things on a significant scale. George was in the main house directing the placement of tables and chairs in the reception hall with the focused intensity of a man whose professional satisfaction depends entirely on the next 6 hours going correctly. Lord Edmund appeared twice in the morning, in the state of controlled excitement that a man produces when something he has been engineering for months is about to conclude in his favor. Darius moved through the morning like a person who is neither part of what is happening, nor entirely separate from it. He was no longer Derek in the way he had been for the past 7 days. That name was done, that person was put down. And he was not yet fully himself in this space, which was a strange interval to occupy. He ate breakfast in the servants' hall without speaking much, and Nora looked at him twice with the particular look she had, the look of someone noticing something without yet knowing what she has noticed. He was in the courtyard near the garden gate when the carriages began arriving. The first came through the repainted front gate at mid-morning, carrying 2 of the provincial lords who had been invited as witnesses to the betrothal announcement. The second followed within the hour, bearing a council member and his wife, and the administrative secretary who handled the official documentation of formal royal events. By the early afternoon, the reception hall was filling with the sound of people who had come a long distance for something significant and wanted to be seen arriving at it. Fletcher came with the 4th carriage. Fletcher Vane was a tall man, with silver at his temples, and the particular quality of stillness that a person develops when they have spent decades in proximity to power and learned to move within it without being moved by it. He got out of the carriage and stood in the courtyard and looked at the estate, and then looked, with great deliberateness, across the courtyard to where Darius was standing near the garden wall. Fletcher walked toward him. He stopped at a distance that was not intimate, but was not public either. "You look," Fletcher said carefully, "considerably less like a household servant than you did 7 days ago." "I feel considerably less like one," Darius said. Fletcher looked at the estate. He looked at the garden gate. He looked at the courtyard stones that had been cleared of moss and the wall section near the north corner, where new mortar had been set. Did you find what you were looking for? He said. Yes, Darius said. And? Darius looked at the garden gate. She is not what the reports said, he said. Better or worse? Fletcher asked. Neither, Darius said. Just entirely different from the picture. Fletcher absorbed this in the particular silence he used, for absorbing information he considered important. And what are you going to do? He said. I am going to go into that hall, Darius said, and I am going to wait and see what she does. Fletcher looked at him for a moment. That is an unusually passive approach from you, he said. Yes, Darius said. It is. Fletcher studied him for a moment longer, with the expression of a man who has served the same person for 11 years, and is now finding himself confronted with a version of that person he has not met before. He did not say anything more. He went toward the main house. Darius stayed in the courtyard. He stood near the garden gate until it was time to go in. The royal announcement of his arrival had been prepared by Fletcher, and was the kind of simple formal communication that these occasions required. When Darius walked through the main doors of the reception hall at the correct time, the room rose, and the sound went out of it, and 50 people stood, because a king had walked into the space. He looked across the room. She was not there. He came to the front of the hall. Lord Edmund was at his side immediately, flushed and formal, saying the expected things in the expected sequence, and Darius answered him with appropriate courtesy, and kept the larger part of his attention on the hall doors at the back of the room. The doors were closed. He stood at the front of the room and thought about all the ways this could go. He had done what he could do. She had heard him through the door. She had said good night, in a way that was not a rejection, but was not an answer either. And now the morning had come, and the hall was full, and the banquet was prepared, and the official documentation was waiting on a table at the side of the room to be signed. He had told her, on the 5th morning, that he thought something was about to be lost that did not need to be. He had asked her not to go. She had said she would think about it. He was finding out now what thinking about it had produced. The doors opened. She came into the hall with Mira 2 steps behind her, wearing a dark blue dress that was simply cut and very fine, and she walked toward the front of the hall with the posture and the pace of a woman who has made a decision and intends to carry it exactly as far as it needs to go. Every face in the room turned to her. She looked at none of them. She looked at Darius. He looked at her. It was the same look she had given him at the garden gate, and in the library, and in the garden. Clear and unguarded, and entirely present. Seeing him, not the crown, not the room, not the occasion, him. She came to the front of the hall and stopped. Lord Edmund moved to make the formal introduction, and she did something that stopped him mid-motion. She turned to face the room. The hall went completely quiet. I have something to say before anything else is announced, she said. Her voice carried easily, without needing to be raised. She had always known how to fill a space without straining for it. Darius was very still. I will enter this arrangement, she said, to the assembled room, on one condition. That condition is partnership, not in the ceremonial sense of the word and not in the convenient sense. Partnership in the actual sense, which means that I have a real place in the decisions that will affect my life and the lives of the people in the province I come from. That I am not a signature at the bottom of a document that other people have already decided the contents of. That the man I stand beside considers me an equal participant in our life together and treats that not as a courtesy, but as an expectation. She paused. The room was absolutely silent. I have spoken to him once, she said. Not in this room, and not with these titles. I have spoken to him, as one person speaks to another. And he listened. I am trusting that was not a temporary condition. She turned and looked at Darius. 50 people in the room looked at the king. He thought about a gate and a garden and a library and a wall and a reading lesson through a partition and a voice coming around a corner and the particular weight of a true thing landing on a man who had been avoiding it. He thought about a bench under an apple tree and a private face and the word pleasant written 3 times in a folder by men who had never sat in the same garden with her. It was not a temporary condition, he said. Then, clearly enough for the room, those are the terms I would have proposed. The silence broke. Lord Pemberton started the applause and the room followed, and the hall filled with the sound of 50 people who had arrived for a formal event and received something considerably more complicated, and who appeared, for the most part, to find this satisfying. Lord Edmund stood slightly to the left, with the expression of a man who is extremely pleased with the outcome, and is still working out exactly which parts of it he can reasonably take credit for. Mira, at the back of the hall, pressed her fingers briefly to her lips, and then went back to her composed expression. The afternoon that followed was what these occasions always were, a long exchange of ceremony and small conversation, and the careful navigation of many people, each of whom had their own specific interest in the proceedings. Darius moved through it, with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this kind of thing for 11 years. He answered questions, and shook hands, and spoke with the provincial lords about things that mattered to the province, and with the council member about the documentation, and with Lord Edmund about the estate, and the terms the lawyers would formalize in the coming weeks. Through all of it, he was aware of where she was in the room, the way he had been aware of her position in the garden, and the corridor, and the kitchen yard, for 7 days. Twice their eyes met across the room. Both times, she looked at him with the same quality. Not warm yet, not easy yet, but real. Near the end of the afternoon, when the formal proceedings had wound down, and the guests were moving between the tables with wine and the comfortable noise of a gathering that has concluded its main business, Darius found her standing at the edge of the east corridor. She had stepped slightly out of the hall, not fully gone but at the margin of it, the way people step to the edge of a loud room, when they need a moment to think inside something quieter. He came to stand near her without making it a pointed thing. They stood side by side for a moment, watching the hall through the doorway. "You stayed," he said. "I was going to go," she said. "I was going to go to Aunt Prudence in the north, and let the arrangement collapse, and deal with whatever came after." "What changed?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought about what you said," she said. "In the garden, on the 5th day. You asked me to stay, and you said something was about to be lost that did not need to be. I thought about that." She paused. "And I thought about what I said to Mira, about the king. And I thought about what you said to me, that you had spent a very long time doing what seemed necessary, without always understanding whether it was also what was good. And I thought that if a man in your position was willing to say that honestly, to a person he had no obligation to be honest with, then the picture I had built from documents was perhaps not the complete picture." He was quiet for a moment. "It was not complete," he said. "The picture is not complete in either direction. You do not know me. I have spent a week in this house and I know more about you than I did, but I do not know you either." "No," she said. "That is what I want to change," he said. She looked at him. The look was the same as it had always been, clear and unguarded, and trying to see the real thing, rather than the expected one. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not a formal one, a real one. I came into your house under a false name, and I heard things you said in private, and I used those things, even if I used them towards something I believe was good, without your knowledge or your consent. That is a wrong thing. I know it is a wrong thing. I am sorry for it." She held his gaze. "You heard me say things about you that were not entirely fair," she said. "They were accurate," he said. "They were accurate about a picture I had constructed from documents," she said. "That is not the same as accurate about you." "They were still accurate," he said. "The part about the counting house. I do that. I have done it for 11 years, and I have called it good governance, and I have not spent enough time thinking about what it costs the people inside the systems I run so efficiently." She was quiet. "Are you going to stop?" she said. "I think," he said carefully, "that I am going to start being less certain that the systems I have built are the best possible version of what they could be." "That is a very measured answer," she said. "I am a measured person," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not." She turned slightly to look at the hall. "I am going to make your life very complicated." "I expect so," he said. She looked at him. "You sound like you don't mind." "I don't," he said. She was quiet for another moment. There was something in her expression that was not yet entirely settled, not doubt, not reluctance, but the specific quality of a person in the middle of the space between one thing and the next, not yet finished arriving at where they are going. "The mortar on the wall in the courtyard," she said. "It will hold through the spring, but it needs to be properly pointed before summer if it is going to last." "I know," he said. "You cannot come back and point it yourself," she said. "You are a king. You have things to do that are not pointing mortar on an estate wall." "I can send someone," he said. "I will send someone," she said. I know who to send. I know which sections need work, and in what order, and what materials they need. I know this estate very well. I know you do, he said. I am going to keep knowing it, she said. I am not leaving it behind. Whatever happens now, the estate remains my responsibility. My father's situation is what it is, and someone has to understand what actually needs doing, and I am the one who understands it. Good, he said. She looked at him. Good? Yes, he said. I have spent a week watching you manage this place. The estate is fortunate to have someone who understands it the way you do. I would not ask you to stop. He paused. I would ask you to eventually be willing to extend that understanding to the province, and after that, perhaps to things of wider scope. But that is later. That is when we know each other better. She studied him. You are offering me things, she said. Why are you offering me things? Because you set a condition this afternoon, he said, and the condition was right. And because I have been thinking for a week about what it actually means to stand beside someone, and I think it means something more than I have previously been willing to act as though it means. He met her eyes. I would like to find out what more looks like. The hall noise moved around them, and the afternoon light was warm through the east windows, and the estate was doing what it had done for all the years it had been standing, holding the people inside it in its stone and plaster and garden and gate, carrying their lives in its ordinary and specific way. She looked at him for a long moment. The apple tree, she said. The third week of spring. You said you would be there. I will be there, he said. It is not negotiable, she said. It is a condition separate from the others. Everything else can be discussed and arranged and formally agreed. That one is not in the documentation. I will be there, he said again. She held his gaze. Something in her expression settled, very slightly. The specific quality of a person who has been waiting to know whether they have made the right choice, and has just received the first real piece of evidence that they might have. All right, she said. She turned and went back into the hall. He watched her go, and then turned to look out the east corridor window at the estate, which was quiet in the gathering late afternoon, the courtyard empty, the garden wall repaired, the gate on its new latch. He thought about what came next. The formal arrangements, the council's satisfaction, the provincial lord's reports, the administrative documentation, the many and various logistical requirements of the coming months. He thought about it all with the organized mind he had always brought to these things. And underneath all of that, quietly present, the specific thought that had been with him since the first morning in this place, since a voice came around a corner at him, and stayed level, and said things that needed to be said, without asking anyone's permission to say them. He was going to have to work at this. He was going to have to become, in some deliberate way, more than the man the reports about him described. Not because she had demanded it. She had asked for partnership, which was reasonable, and had not asked him to transform himself. But because the past 7 days had produced something he had not expected to find, which was the specific and inconvenient knowledge that a better version of how he was doing things had been available to him, and he had not been doing it. She was going to make his life complicated. He had said he didn't mind. He had meant it in a way that surprised him, not as a polite concession, but as something that was genuinely true, the way the truest things are true, without his having planned for them to be. He went back into the hall. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing about the arrangement of 2 actual people, as opposed to 2 names in a document, was simple. They argued in the first month about the provincial tax structure, and the argument lasted 3 days, and was not resolved so much as suspended, while both of them ran out of new things to say. She sat in on the first council meeting she was invited to, and said something in the first 15 minutes that made 4 council members go quiet, and one of them say, afterward, that she had identified in 90 seconds a structural problem that had been present in the system for 6 years. He told her this, and she said she was glad, and also that the council needed to meet in smaller groups where people could speak without performing for the room. And he thought about that for a week before he agreed with her, and then he changed the meeting format. She managed the estate and the province, and the things he had offered her, with the specific qualities she brought to everything, carefully, completely, and without requiring anyone's permission to find the right answer and implement it. She made mistakes, he made mistakes. When he made them, she was direct about it, in the private way she had been direct about everything, since the day he fixed the gate. The apple tree bloomed in the 3rd week of spring. He arrived at the Calwell estate 2 days before it happened because he was not willing to risk the timing, and Serafina found this when she came to meet him at the repainted gate, privately and genuinely funny. She did not say so out loud, but she smiled with the real smile, not the one for the room, and he saw it. They stood under the tree on the morning it bloomed and looked at the white flowers opening in the thin spring light, and the garden was quiet around them, and the gate behind them was solid and silent on its repaired latch. "My mother planted it the year I was born," she said. "You told me," he said. "The 5th day." "You remember that," she said. "I remember everything," he said. "From that week. All of it." She looked at him, the same look, clear and direct, and finding the real thing rather than the expected one. "I know," she said. "So do I." The tree moved in the morning wind, and the white flowers fell, and the spring light moved across the garden, and the estate held them both in its stone and its history, and its quiet early morning, and for a long time, neither of them said anything at all. There was nothing that needed to be added to what was already there. On the 3rd afternoon, he found himself doing something he had not expected to do. He had been sent to clear the storage room behind the kitchen, a room that had accumulated the particular density of objects that accumulates in a space used for overflow and never quite cleared out. Old implements, broken crockery, supplies that had been put away against future need and then forgotten, baskets, rope, a leather harness with a cracked strap. George wanted it sorted before the spring cleaning, which was approaching, and he had assigned the task to Darius, with the instruction to separate useful things from things that needed disposal. Darius had been working his way through the room methodically for about an hour when Serafina came in. She came in the way she always came into spaces, with purpose, looking for something specific. She saw him and stopped but did not seem surprised. "The old seed trays," she said. "George said they were in here." He found them against the far wall, a stack of 12 wooden trays in various states of repair. He brought them out, and she examined each one, stacking the good ones to the left and setting the cracked ones aside. "These 4 need replacing," she said. "The rest are fine." "There is wood in the north barn," Darius said. "I could make 4 trays tomorrow morning, if you needed them before the planting week." She looked at him with the slightly arrested attention she sometimes gave him when he said something that exceeded what the role he was presenting required. "You make things?" she said. "Simple things," he said. "Boxes, frames, joinery work." He picked up one of the damaged trays and turned it over. The corner join had split from age and weight. "This is straightforward work, 20 minutes each." "Then yes," she said. "Please." She took the good trays and went out. He went back to sorting the storage room. Later, he thought about the specific texture of that exchange, the complete absence of complication in it, the way she had seen a need, and immediately connected it to something he could do, and made the request without making anything of the request. She dealt in the practical reality of things. There was something about the way she moved through the world, noticing what needed doing and seeing who could do it, and connecting those two things without ceremony, that reminded him of the best people he had ever worked with. Not the most powerful people, the best ones. He thought about this on his way to dinner, and he thought about it during dinner, and he lay on the bed that night and thought about it some more, because it kept returning to him even when he tried to put it aside, which was itself information he was not quite sure what to do with. On the 4th morning, before the conversation in the corridor that changed everything, he was in the kitchen, collecting tools from the small storage shelf near the entrance, when he saw something through the door, into the main kitchen, that he had not expected to see. Kit, the kitchen boy, was showing Clara something in a book. Not a recipe book. Clara did not need recipes. She carried everything she needed in her memory after 40 years of cooking. It was a different book, smaller, with a simple binding. Kit had it open on the kitchen table, and Clara was standing beside him, leaning over to look at it, and whatever Kit was reading aloud to her, Clara was listening to with a specific quality of attention. Not her usual operational attention, but a different kind. The kind that comes when you are being given something valuable by someone you did not expect to give it. Darius watched for a moment through the door. Kit read slowly and carefully. He did not have the fluency of a practiced reader yet, but he had the sound of someone who understood what the words meant, who was not just decoding sounds but comprehending the thing they were carrying. He stumbled on one word, went back, tried again, got it. Clara said nothing, just waited. He moved on. When the small passage was finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without looking at Kit, "Read that last part again." "Good," she said, and she turned back to her pots. But the word sat differently from the way Clara usually deployed the word good, which was a functional word in her vocabulary. A word that meant adequate or complete, or as expected. This one was different. It had a texture. Darius moved away from the door. He thought about Serafina 3 mornings a week in a study, doing the patient work of going back to the beginning without frustration. He thought about Kit at the kitchen table, reading to Clara, while Clara pretended not to be particularly affected. He thought about what it meant to give something to a person that they had never been given before, and what it made of the person who gave it. He knew what the word pleasant meant. He had known what it meant when he first read it in the report. It was the word you used when you saw that something was not displeasing and did not look any further. It was the word that required the least from the person using it. He went to work on the upper shelves and thought about all the things that word had failed to carry. That night, after the dinner table had been cleared, and Nora had finished her account of the kitchen cat's continued campaign against the breadbasket, and George had retreated to his evening work, and the hall had gone quiet with the natural settling of a household at the end of its day, Darius sat with his cup of tea at the end of the bench and thought about the week. 6 days. He had been here 6 days. He had arrived with a plan, and a timeline, and a defined objective, and he was now sitting in the servants' hall of a declining estate in the southern province, with his hands around a cup of cooling tea, thinking about a woman who made seed trays happen, and taught a kitchen boy to read, and argued her father into practical decisions, and stood in the rain for a farmer's horses, and carried mortar cloths in her coat pocket, specifically so she could help with work she had not been asked to help with. He thought about Fletcher's question in the strategy room. "What are you hoping to find?" "Something true," Darius had said. He had found something true. Several true things. The problem with finding true things was that true things required you to do something with them, and what this particular collection of true things required of him was not clear and simple, but was instead complicated and immediate and needed to be addressed before he ran out of days. He finished the tea. He went to bed. He lay there for a long time before sleeping, listening to the estate breathe around him, and he thought about what the next day needed to contain. In those days he also came to understand the household in a way that made the estate feel real to him, in a way that the provincial reports had never achieved. Clara, who had appeared in his first minutes as a figure of kitchen authority, revealed herself over the days to be a woman of considerable intelligence and deep local knowledge, who had essentially been running the practical operations of the Calwell estate for 30 years, with minimal credit and no formal title. She knew which tenant farmers were struggling and which were doing well. She knew the state of the roads in the South Quarter. She knew when the weather was going to change from the way the light fell in the evening, and she was right, more often than anyone who tracked it formally. George was a different kind of person, precise, formal, carrying his competence as a kind of personal code rather than a natural attribute. But he had been at the Calwell estate for 22 years, and he loved it in the specific way that people who invest their professional lives in a place come to love it. Not sentimentally, but practically, in the sense that its well-being was inseparable from his own sense of order and rightness in the world. Nora was 22, and had grown up in the village, and had come to work in the kitchen 3 years ago, and had a gift for noticing things, and an inability to keep what she noticed to herself, which made her the most reliable source of information in the household. And Kit, who was 12 and read haltingly, and was now reading to Clara in the kitchen, had come from a situation that Darius learned about only in fragments, from what Nora said without saying it directly, which was the way people in close communities talk about things that are difficult. He had needed work. He had found his way here. Serafina had noticed him in the first week. Darius thought about the province. He thought about what it meant to actually understand a place, not in the way a document understood it, not in the way a map or a report understood it, but in the way that Clara understood it, or Serafina understood her estate. He thought about the distance between the reports on his strategy room table and the actual living reality of the province they described. He thought about a very large number of things over those 7 days that he had not been thinking about before he arrived. On the 6th evening, the one before he told her, he sat in the garden after dark. He had no reason to be there. He had no task, no assignment. He had simply walked out into the garden because the servants' block felt too small for what he was thinking, and the courtyard felt too public, and the garden was the place where he had found it was possible to think without being managed. He sat on the bench under the apple tree. The apple tree was bare-limbed against the dark sky, the first faint signs of bud showing at the branch tips if you looked closely in the daylight, but invisible at night. In 3 weeks, or perhaps 4, it would be covered in white flowers. He had not been told this yet. He had simply looked at the tree on several days with the attention he gave to growing things, and understood that it was close. He sat under the tree and thought about what he was going to say when the moment came. He had been rehearsing it, in the way he sometimes rehearsed important speeches, not memorizing words but understanding the architecture of what needed to be conveyed. The essential truth of it was not complicated. He had come here under a false name, to find something the reports had missed. He had found it. And what he had found had changed the way he understood both the situation and himself. And he needed to tell her that. And the telling would not be comfortable. And the discomfort was not something he could avoid by being clever about how he phrased it. He had come in through a deception. The way out of it was directness. He sat under the bare-limbed apple tree in the dark garden, and the estate was quiet around him. And he thought about a woman on this same bench, looking up at the sky through these branches with her private face on. And he thought about the word pleasant, and he thought about all the ways that a true thing can be missed by a person who is not looking for it. And he breathed the cold evening air, and waited for the right moment to find him. The right moment, when it came, turned out not to be the one he had planned. It never was. There were things he had not expected to think about during those 7 days, and he thought about all of them. He had not expected to think about loneliness. He was not in the habit of thinking about loneliness, because loneliness was a word that required a certain kind of acknowledgement that he had not historically permitted himself. Kings were not supposed to be lonely. They were surrounded at all times. Their presence was requested constantly. Their company was competed for. The idea that a person at the center of that much attention could be lonely was the kind of idea that required either great self-pity or great honesty, and he had always preferred not to use either too freely. But he thought about it in those 7 days, because being in the servants' hall at dinner, genuinely unnoticed, genuinely present in a room as simply a person, produced a quality of ease that he had not felt in years, and whose absence he had not known he was managing until it was temporarily present. The palace was full of people performing for the king. Every conversation he had inside it had the specific weight of a conversation that was being had with the king, which was a different thing entirely from a conversation between people. The person speaking to him was always also managing the fact that they were speaking to him, managing how they were coming across, what impression they were making, what he might do with what they said, whether they were saying the right thing. He had grown so accustomed to this that he had stopped fully noticing it. He had started to think that this was simply what conversation felt like. And then he had spent a week in a servants' hall where nobody was managing anything about talking to him, because nobody knew who he was. They talked to him the way Nora had talked to him when he asked about Serafina, directly and without calculation, saying what they actually thought. George managed his own version of careful, but it was the care of a professional, not the care of a person monitoring the king's reactions. Clara ignored him most of the time, in the way she ignored everyone who was not actively in her kitchen, performing a task that required her attention. These were the real versions of the people they were, not the performance versions, and sitting among them was so unexpectedly pleasant that he had noticed it like a physical sensation on his second evening, and had not known quite what to do with the noticing. What he had not expected, and what he thought about on the bench under the apple tree in the dark, was that she was like that. She was the most like that of anyone in the house, including the servants. She did not perform for him at all. She had not known who he was, so there was no crown to perform for, but he had spent enough time watching people be themselves in relaxed situations and perform in formal ones, that he knew the difference. And what she had been, from the first day at the gate, was entirely real. No version of herself adjusted for the audience. No calculation of impression, just Serafina, thinking and speaking and doing what needed to be done, with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, regardless of who was watching. He thought about what it would be like to have that be the ordinary texture of his days. It was not a thought he let himself extend very far. There was too much else to manage. But the thought was there, available to him, and he kept returning to it the way you return to a doorway that is letting in light when the room is otherwise dark. The night before the banquet, after the corridor conversation and the door, he lay awake for a long time. He was not anxious, exactly. Anxiety was a feeling for uncertain situations, and his situation was not uncertain in the way anxiety required. He knew what was happening. He knew what was at stake. He knew what the morning would bring. What he felt instead was something more like the specific alertness of standing at the edge of something significant, where all the thinking has been done, and the doing is what remains, and the doing depends on someone else's decision. He had done what he could do. He had said the thing through the door, and it was the right thing, and it had been received in silence, and the silence had been broken by her voice saying his name in a way that was not rejection. Whether it was enough was not his to decide. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the folder on the council table. He thought about the very first morning on the cart, when Owen had said she stood in a tenant's yard in the rain in her good dress, and argued until her father backed down, and he had filed this detail in the organized part of his mind because it seemed important, even then, without knowing why. He thought about what he was going to do differently. Not as an abstraction. He was past abstractions about himself. He thought about it concretely. The council format. The way reports were gathered, and by whom, and with what instructions about what to look for. The physical distance between the palace and the southern province, which was a 6-hour ride, and which meant that what he knew about the province was filtered through so many layers of interpretation that by the time it reached him, it had very little of the actual province left in it. He thought about Clara and what she knew about the roads and the tenant farmers and the state of things that was not in any report. He thought about the people in this house who knew things that none of his advisors knew because they were here and the advisors were not. He thought about a woman who read books about land survey methods and taxation reform and agricultural policy and made notes that her father did not know about and thought about governance in the specific way of someone who has been watching governance fail from very close up and has formed detailed opinions about what would work better. He thought, she should be in a room with the people who make the decisions. He thought, she should be one of the people who makes the decisions. He thought about what that would look like, practically, in the context of a kingdom. He had not designed the kingdom's decision-making structures with this kind of inclusion in mind. Most of those structures had been inherited rather than designed. The inherited ones assumed a particular distribution of knowledge and authority that he had never seriously questioned. He found, lying in the dark on the narrow servant's bed for the last time, that he was thinking about the kingdom differently. Not in the way he thought about it when he was managing it, efficiently, in terms of systems and outcomes and strategic positioning, but in a different way, a slightly slower way, a way that included more of the actual people inside the systems and fewer of the abstract categories he had been filing them in. It was uncomfortable in a way he recognized as useful. The specific discomfort of discovering that you have been doing something important less well than it needed to be done, and that you could do it better, and that better was available to you if you were willing to change the way you were operating. That kind of discomfort was not something he ran from. He had spent his life leaning into that kind of thing. It was what he was best at, in truth. Not the ceremony or the authority or the strategic positioning, but the specific willingness to look at a thing he was doing, see where it was inadequate, and change it. He was going to change things. He did not know yet exactly how, or in what order, or how much resistance he was going to meet from a council that had been operating a particular way for a long time and would find modification uncomfortable. He knew that the resistance would come and that he would manage it because he was good at managing resistance. He also knew, lying there in the dark, that the particular quality of change he was moving toward would be much easier to reach with someone who was good at seeing what the systems missed. He thought about a green book about land taxation and a woman who had read it 3 times. He closed his eyes. The morning was coming. Whatever the morning brought, he would meet it the way he met everything, directly and without looking away. He slept. The morning came with clear light and cold air, and the specific forward momentum of a day that had been prepared for and could not now be stopped. He dressed. He went out. He moved through the last hours before the banquet in the particular state of a person who has said everything sayable and is waiting for the world to respond. He thought, in those hours, about the words she had said through the door. She had asked, was any of it real? For you. He had said, all of it. He had meant it precisely. He had not meant it as reassurance. He had not said it to soften the situation, or to produce a particular response. He had said it because it was the truth, in the clearest available form. and the situation required nothing less than the clearest available form. All of it had been real. The gate, and the wall, and the library, and the rain, and the garden morning, and the bench, and the tree. The conversation about what he would do if the situation were open, the reading lesson he had heard through a wall, the moment in the paddock when he had looked at her and understood that she was someone who gave people the specific quality of her attention and expected nothing particular in return. All of it had happened to him, the way things only happen when you are fully present for them, clearly, completely, without the management layer that usually stood between him and direct experience. He had been fully present for 7 days, in a way he had not been for 11 years. He was not going back to the other way. He had not thought, when he accepted the council's folder and the council's plan, that any of what followed would be possible. He had thought in terms of assessments. He had thought in terms of variables and outcomes. He had made the decision to come here as an act of information gathering, and he had come well prepared with the mindset of a person who gathers information systematically and converts it into decisions. What he had not planned for was finding himself in the middle of 7 days that were the most quietly honest days he had spent in as long as he could clearly remember, and what he had not planned for was discovering that the person at the center of them was not a subject of assessment, but someone he had been having real conversations with, and that those conversations had changed things about him that he had not anticipated needing to change. He thought about this on the last morning in the servants' block, dressing in the dark while the estate was still asleep. He thought about it with the same deliberate attention he had brought to every other important question in his life, and he arrived at the same conclusion he had arrived at the night before, which was that, whatever happened in the hall that day, he was not going to use authority to override her decision. He had come here to find something true. What he had found was true in more directions than he had planned for, and one of those directions pointed directly at the fact that a person who was going to be made to be in a situation against her will was never going to be fully present in it. He wanted her present, not positioned, present. That was the new thing. That was the thing those 7 days had produced, that all the council meetings and all the strategic planning and all the efficient machinery of the palace had never produced. He wanted the actual person in the room. He had spent 11 years conducting things at a level of remove that had kept the essential management smooth and clean and functional, and what he had discovered in the servants' hall and the garden and the library and at a horse paddock fence was that smooth and clean and functional was not the same as actually having someone with you, and the gap between those two things was the gap he had been living in, and it was large. The morning of the banquet, when he stood in the front of the hall with the assembled room and looked at the door, he was not thinking about the council's satisfaction, or the province's stability, or the administrative documentation waiting at the side of the room. He was thinking about whether the door was going to open. When it did, and she came through it and looked at him across the room with the same look she had given him at the gate on the second morning, that specific, undivided, unsoftened look, he felt it the same way he had felt the near miss with Lord Pemberton's carriage, the same push, the same sudden complete awareness of everything in the moment. He had prepared a formal greeting. He set it aside. She came to the front of the hall, and he watched her turn to the room and say what she had to say, and he watched the room absorb it, and he looked at her, while she spoke with the full attention he had spent 7 days, learning to recognize when she turned it on him. She was not performing. She was saying exactly what she had decided to say, in the exact words that said it, with her face entirely clear, and her voice entirely level, and her hands at her sides, and nothing extra in any direction. He had agreed without having to think about it, because the agreement was something that was already true before she said the words. She had simply said the words that made the true thing visible in the room. Afterward, when the formal proceedings had gone on long enough that people had settled into the comfort of a gathering that has accomplished its main purpose, he found Fletcher standing near the east corridor with a cup of wine and an expression of contained assessment. "She is not pleasant," Fletcher said. "No," Darius said. "She is better than pleasant," Fletcher said. "Considerably," Darius said. Fletcher looked into his wine cup. "You look different," he said, "than when you left. I have been stacking timber and resetting mortar joints, and taking farm carts through country roads," Darius said. "That is not what I mean," Fletcher said. Darius was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I know what you mean." Fletcher looked at him with the long, careful regard of a man who had served 11 years and was now being shown something he had not seen before in those years. He did not say what it was. He simply nodded once, in the particular way that means, I see this, and I think it is good, and I will not make a thing of it. Darius moved on into the room. The afternoon of the banquet was the beginning of something, rather than the conclusion of something, which was how he had not thought of it when Fletcher first put the folder on the council table. He had thought of it as a conclusion, the final arrangement of a variable that had been identified as needing to be arranged. He had been wrong about that. It was not a conclusion. It was a beginning, and the beginning was specific and irreducible, and carried the particular character of beginnings that come out of honesty rather than strategy. She had said she would make his life complicated. He had said he didn't mind. Neither of those things had been polite statements made in the direction of a workable arrangement. They had been accurate statements about what was actually true, which was the only kind of statement he now intended to traffic in. In the first months, he went to the estate 4 times when he did not formally need to. Fletcher noted this without comment for the first 2 visits, and then, on the third, said in the margins of a routing document that the southern route inspection schedule had been moved forward, which was a diplomatic fiction they both understood, and which Darius appreciated for its discretion. He and Serafina argued about 6 things of substance in the first 3 months. 2 of those arguments were resolved. 2 were suspended and returned to later, with additional information, and then resolved differently than either of them had originally proposed. 2 remained open, which both of them found productive in the sense that open arguments kept them thinking. She came to the capital once in that period, to the palace, and walked through the rooms with the specific attention she brought to every new space, noting what it was, and what it was for, and what it might become if something were done differently. And she had 2 conversations with council members that the council members described afterward, to Darius, with the expressions of people who have unexpectedly encountered something very sharp without being harmed by it. She told him, on the second morning of her visit, that the strategy room needed better light through the north window, because the current light made the maps difficult to read accurately, which was probably contributing to some of the provincial misreadings he had been noting in the annual assessments. He had looked at the north window and thought about how many years he had been in that room and had not noticed the light. He had the window enlarged the following month. She noticed this on her second visit and said nothing about it at the time. Later, on a quiet evening when the formal day was done and they were sitting in the east garden of the palace with the last of the spring light on the old stone walls, she said, "You changed the window." "The light was inadequate," he said. "Yes," she said, "it was." They sat in the garden for a long time after that, and the light changed around them, and it was the same quality of shared quiet that had existed in the garden of the Caldwell estate under the apple tree, the comfortable silence of 2 people who had nothing they needed to perform for each other, and everything they wanted to say, eventually available to them, at whatever pace things chose to arrive. "I have been thinking about the council meeting format," she said, at some point. "I know," he said. "I changed it." She looked at him. "You changed it before I had the chance to say anything about it." "I knew what you were going to say," he said. "You had been thinking about it since the first meeting. You have an expression when you are preparing to recommend a structural change." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of expression?" she said. "The same one you had when you were looking at the gate latch," he said. "The one that says you have identified the problem, and you know the solution, and you are deciding how to present it." She looked at the garden wall. "I am not certain whether to be reassured or alarmed that you can read that," she said. "Both," he said. "Probably both." She was quiet again. Then, "I am glad you changed the window." "I know," he said. They sat until the light was gone, and the first stars came out above the palace walls, and the spring evening was mild, and the garden smelled of the early flowers, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, because the long silence between 2 people who understand each other is not empty but full, and they had learned to let it be full, rather than filling it with words that did not add anything. She made his life more complicated. He had said he didn't mind, and he had been right. The complication of it was the best thing about it, the fact that no decision he made went unconsidered, no policy proceeded unchallenged, no assumption he had carried for years survived her attention unexamined. She was not obstructive, she was not contrary. She simply had a very good mind, and a very clear moral sense, and a complete absence of any impulse to tell him what he wanted to hear, rather than what she actually thought. He had wanted, sitting in the servants' hall of a declining estate in the southern province, to be spoken to honestly by someone who was not performing for him. He had found that. It turned out to be the most disruptive and the most valuable thing that had ever come into his life, in that order, and he was not sorry about either. The apple tree bloomed. They were both there when it did.